They said silence was the greatest weapon of the empire. Not the armies, not the blades, not even the towering walls of the forbidden city, but silence. The silence of fear, the silence of witnesses who dared not speak, the silence of men and women dragged into the shadow of punishment so terrifying that even the memory of their screams was forbidden. In ancient China, power was not only displayed in golden palaces and dragon-emblazoned robes, it was carved into human flesh, written into the bones of the condemned. These were not merely executions. They were performances designed to terrify, to erase, and to remind every trembling subject of what it meant to defy the Son of Heaven. And yet, behind every cruel spectacle, there was always a human being, a heart that beat, eyes that begged, and a soul that longed for dignity even as the empire stripped it away. In the vast stretches of imperial rule, punishment was never just about justice. It was about order, about bending the will of millions beneath the throne's shadow. The officials called it law, but the condemned knew better. It was theater, a stage where pain was orchestrated with precision. Imagine standing in the marketplace, the scent of roasted chestnuts in the air, and suddenly a procession enters. The condemned is carried forward, their face pale, their lips trembling. A decree is read aloud, the emperor's voice made present through the herald's booming tone. And then, in front of the gathered crowd, the punishment begins. Not swift, not merciful, but slow, deliberate, unforgettable. One of the most feared punishments was Lingchi, known to foreigners as the death by 1,000 cuts. To hear the name is dreadful, but to witness it was to feel the soul quake. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame, their arms and legs stretched outward like an unwilling offering. A skilled executioner, trained not in haste but in precision, would begin. The first cut was shallow, almost merciful. A sliver of flesh taken from the chest, a mere whisper of steel against skin. The second cut followed, then a third. The body became a map of agony, carved open piece by piece. And here was the horror. The executioner was trained to keep the victim alive for as long as possible. Not to kill, but to prolong. Each slice was a message to the people. This is what defiance looks like. But what history books rarely tell is the human truth. How some victims pleaded for mercy with every cut, how others screamed until their voices collapsed, how a few, in rare defiance, endured in silence, their eyes fixed upon the heavens as though daring even the emperor to break their dignity. One chronicler wrote of a man accused of treason who endured over 3,000 cuts, still alive until the final blow. Can you imagine the mind's journey through that? From disbelief to agony to numbness to perhaps a strange acceptance? And all the while the crowd watched. Some wept, some turned away, some cheered, because fear has a way of twisting human hearts into complicity. Yet Lingchi was not the only nightmare etched into China's long history. There was the punishment of boiling, where a great cauldron of oil or water would be heated until bubbling, the steam rising like the breath of some angry god. Into it, the condemned would be lowered, sometimes whole, sometimes piece by piece. Skin blistered, eyes bulged, and the air filled with the sickening sound of human flesh cooking. The cruelty was not only physical but psychological. Often, family members or officials were forced to watch. Imagine a son seeing his father lowered into the pot, forbidden to cry, because to weep too openly might be seen as disloyalty. The cruelty extended beyond the body, into the heart of families and generations. Then there was the kang, a punishment less bloody but equally dehumanizing. A wooden collar, massive and heavy, locked around the neck, forcing the condemned to stumble awkwardly in public. The kang did not kill quickly. It starved, humiliated, and isolated. Those sentenced to wear it for weeks could not feed themselves, could not lie down, could not embrace a loved one. They depended on the mercy of strangers, and many strangers refused, fearing guilt by association. What greater torment than to be reduced from a human being into a spectacle of shame, your dignity stolen day by day. And yet, amid all this cruelty, there lingers an unspoken truth. These punishments were never just about crime. They were about control. They were about reminding the peasant tilling the soil, the scholar writing in his study, the general leading his troops, that the emperor's power was absolute. It was a theater of terror, a spectacle where pain became policy. And though centuries have passed, though empires have risen and fallen, one question remains. What happens to a society when justice is replaced by fear? When punishment becomes not a correction but a performance? Consider the punishment called slow slicing of exile. Unlike Lingchi, it was not the body that was cut apart but the soul. Families were torn from their homes, marched across deserts or frozen frontiers, condemned to live in desolate places where hunger and loneliness gnawed at them for years. In some ways, it was worse than death. To die quickly was an end, but exile? Exile was a living death, a slow fading into nothingness, where your children forgot the sound of laughter, where your name dissolved into dust. What makes these punishments so haunting is not just the pain itself, but the silence that followed. The survivors never spoke of what they saw. The families carried shame so heavy it bent their backs for generations. And history often softened the edges, describing these methods in brief phrases, as though words could not, or should not, capture the reality of flesh torn, bones crushed, lives destroyed. But behind every sanitized sentence was a person. Someone who once walked, breathed, dreamed, loved. Someone who, in their final moments, may have clung to dignity, even as the empire tried to strip it away. And so, as we look back upon these punishments, we must not see them as curiosities of a cruel past. We must see them as mirrors, reminders of how easily human beings can become tools of fear, how justice can be twisted into spectacle, and how dignity, once stolen, leaves a silence that echoes for centuries. But the cruelty of ancient punishments did not always involve fire, steel, or exile. Sometimes, it came in the form of psychological torment so refined that the condemned were broken long before their bodies were touched. One such method was the punishment of prolonged anticipation, where the victim was told they would die, but the day of execution was withheld. They awoke each morning to the sound of footsteps, each day believing it was their last, each day surviving only to relive the terror. Some begged for death, whispering prayers for release, while others lost their minds, their sanity crumbling like old parchment. The blade, when it finally arrived, was almost merciful. Imagine the depth of fear when a human being ceases to fear death itself and begins to crave it. The empire understood this well. Fear was more powerful than pain. And so, punishments were designed not only to destroy the condemned but to poison the hearts of those who witnessed them. Consider the punishment of the waist chop. A single swing of the executioner's blade, severing the body in half at the waist. Swift, brutal, and absolute. Yet even here, cruelty found its way into the cracks of mercy. Records tell of condemned men who remained conscious for a few moments after being halved, their eyes wide in shock, their mouths struggling to form words. Crowds gasped, mothers shielded their children, but the empire looked on with satisfaction. This was not a warning, it was a lesson carved into human memory. Then there was the punishment of forced suicide. To outsiders, it may seem almost merciful, allowing the condemned to die by their own hand rather than by the blade of another. But imagine the cruelty of being ordered to destroy yourself, to drink poison or hang a rope, not out of choice but as a command of the throne. Imagine the silence of a scholar's chamber, where a loyal servant lays down a bowl of bitter wine laced with death, and the scholar, shaking, takes it in trembling hands. No cries of a crowd, no steel against skin, only the quiet dignity of a life ending in forced obedience. Families were often gathered to witness, not allowed to weep too loudly, lest their grief be seen as defiance. Among the most chilling stories comes from the Ming dynasty, when eunuchs, men castrated to serve the emperor, were given the task of carrying out certain punishments. Eunuchs, robbed of their own dignity, became instruments of indignity for others. Some carried out tortures with calculated precision, for their loyalty was bound by fear and their survival tied to cruelty. Imagine standing before such a figure, a man both victim and perpetrator, his own suffering twisted into the tool of your destruction. What greater tragedy than a system that turns broken men into instruments of breaking others? The cruelty was not always directed at the guilty alone. Entire families were often condemned. The punishment of collective execution meant that not only the accused but also his parents, his wife, his children, sometimes even his servants would be slaughtered. Guilt was not an individual weight but a net cast wide. The accused might be guilty or perhaps innocent, but once the decree was issued, the punishment was absolute. Imagine a father watching his son executed for his supposed crimes. Imagine a child screaming as soldiers dragged her mother into the square. The empire thrived on this terror, for it reminded every subject that loyalty was not only personal, it was inherited, demanded across generations. But in the cracks of cruelty, there were still sparks of human resistance. Some prisoners sang before their executions, their voices breaking through the silence of fear. Some faced torture with unwavering gazes, their dignity untouchable even as their bodies were destroyed. One tale tells of a general accused of treason, condemned to Lingchi. Before the first cut was made, he cried out not in fear but in defiance, "My loyalty is my blood. Take it, but it will not serve your throne." Even as the knife sliced, his spirit refused to bow. These moments remind us that dignity can survive even in the face of horror, that humanity is not so easily extinguished. What makes these punishments so terrifying is not simply the brutality itself, but the way they turned human beings into instruments of their own oppression. Crowds gathered to watch, not always out of cruelty, but out of fear of being absent. To not watch was suspicious. To not cheer was dangerous. And so, ordinary men and women became participants in a theater of pain, their silence feeding the empire's power. This complicity was perhaps the greatest cruelty of all, the way terror spread like a disease, infecting not only the condemned but every heart that bore witness. We must ask ourselves, why remember these horrors? Why recount the boiling cauldrons, the thousand cuts, the cries silenced by the Kang? It is not to revel in cruelty. It is not to decorate history with blood. It is to remember that justice without compassion becomes tyranny, and power without mercy becomes inhuman. Ancient China is not alone in this truth. Rome had its crucifixions, Europe its burning stakes, and every empire has written its authority in the suffering of its people. But to remember is to resist, to say that the screams of the past will not be forgotten, that dignity, once stolen, still matters. As the centuries passed, many of these punishments were outlawed, condemned as barbaric even by the rulers who once commanded them. But the shadows remain, the stories whispered through generations, the scars carved into cultural memory, the silence passed down from ancestor to child. All these linger. When we look at the ruins of empires, we often see palaces, temples, great walls stretching across mountains. But hidden within the stones are voices, voices of the condemned, asking not to be forgotten. So when we speak of ancient punishments, we must speak not only of emperors and laws but of people. Of the young woman who carried the Kang until her neck bled, of the scholar who drank poison with trembling lips, of the traitor or perhaps the patriot who endured 1,000 cuts yet died unbroken. These are not nameless shadows in history. They are human beings whose suffering reminds us of the fragile line between justice and cruelty, between dignity and despair. And perhaps the most haunting lesson of all is this: cruelty never truly disappears. It changes shape, hides behind new words, cloaks itself in new robes. But the heart of cruelty, the desire to control through fear, remains. That is why we must remember, why we must tell these stories. Because in remembering, we guard against repeating. In honoring the dignity of the broken, we strengthen the dignity of the living. The silence that once protected emperors now belongs to history, but we can break it. We can give voice to those who suffered, not as spectacles, not as curiosities, but as human beings. And in that act, we remind ourselves of what it means to be truly human, to resist fear, to cling to dignity, to demand justice, even in the face of the most horrific punishments the world has ever known.